Good morning to everybody who's joined so far. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for people to let themselves in. Okay, so I can see the numbers ticking up quite merrily, so we'll just continue to let people to join, but I'm conscious of the fact that it's 2 minutes past 10, so we will make a start. So the first thing that I have to say is a really warm welcome to everyone who's taken the time to join us this morning. We're looking, so my name is Janine Green, I'm self-employed. I work in ASB supporting housing associations, local authorities and police forces in tackling ASB and supporting victims. I'm really delighted to be co-hosting this session this morning with Forbes solicitors. And I think it's fair to say that we were pretty much blown away by the interest that we had in this session. I know that I, for one, am not looking at the number of delegates because I think I'd rather not know. So I'm very much pretending that I'm just talking to 6 colleagues on a screen. But joking aside, it's really wonderful to see that so many people have an interest in this subject. And I'm always quite overwhelmed by the appetite for learning that there's in the sector and the want to share best practice. So hopefully it's going to make for a really enjoyable hour this morning. There's a few things that I need to make you aware of from a tech side of things. So I would imagine we're now, 18 months through the pandemic, and most of you will be quite familiar now, I would imagine, with doing things like this and jumping on webinars and using the Zoom webinar software. A few things to say: it's quite different to Zoom meetings, so please don't worry that you can't see your face on the screen, and please also don't worry that you're muted. That's just part of the Zoom webinar functionality. If you have tech issues, obviously, unfortunately, that's something that we can't really resolve if it's on your end in terms of internet connection. Things happen. But what I would say as a note of reassurance is that we are recording this session, and everybody who signed up today, whether you're able to join us or not, will receive a copy of the recording. So one way or another, you will get to view the content and the discussions from today. One thing that you may well notice is that we haven't included the function to be able to ask questions. That's been done purposefully. Anybody that attended the last webinar that I did around ringer doorbells will probably have seen the steam coming out of my ears while I was busily trying to chat and keep a track of all the questions. And it was really, really, really difficult to do. So because of the numbers for today, what we've decided to do instead was that we asked you to submit questions in advance. And what we've done is we've based our conversations today very much on those questions. A lot of those questions were very similar, which shows to us that the problems that you are having, some of the experiences that you're having, are very, very similar. And we hope, therefore, that we've managed to capture most of your questions. That said, there may be some things that we don't cover that you perhaps want to explore a little bit more. So you will, in the email that follows this session, you will get contact details from myself and Darren, and you are more than welcome to get in touch and talk things over with us a little bit further. So hopefully one way or another, within the limitations of the hour session, you will be able to get the information that you're looking for. So to tell you a little bit about the format, we're doing things slightly differently today. So again, anybody that's perhaps attended past webinars like this that we've arranged, they tend to take a more kind of structured format of, having maybe 2 or 3 speakers that present with slides for 5 to 10 minutes, and then a little bit of a panel discussion. We're really lucky today that we've got practitioners from a real wide range of agencies, experiences, backgrounds. So what we really wanted to do was just have a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of a chat based on the questions that you've provided, talking through what the challenges are with tackling cannabis smoking, and I guess most importantly what some of the solutions might be. It's absolutely fair to say that there isn't a magic bullet for dealing with cannabis smoking, and I cannot promise you that what you're going to get out of the next hour is an absolute process, that if somebody reports cannabis smoking to you, you do A, you do B, you do C, and the world is happy again. That just isn't possible for all the reasons that you'll know about how challenging this issue is. But what I really hope that you will leave with is some additional ideas, some additional thinking, some additional best practice that you can then take away and explore further back within your partnerships and your agencies, etc. So hopefully that's giving you a kind of good idea of how we're going to be structuring today. Before I hand over to Darren, who's going to be chairing the session and posing the questions, I just wanted to introduce our panel today. So I'm going to start with Craig. So Craig is the team leader at Hyde Housing. So Craig is very much going to come from a position of the challenges that cannabis smoking presents for those of us who might be registered providers for social housing. Going round in a circle, I've then got Inspector John Tootle, who works for West Yorkshire Police. I think, very often a question is, well, it's a criminal offence, so, is this not a police problem? So John has very much agreed to be part of the conversation today and help manage our expectations around some of the challenges that the police face as well. We've then got Kirsty Varley, who is a partner at Forbes Solicitors in the Housing and Regeneration team. Kirsty obviously brings a huge amount of experience in terms of the legal tools and powers. And Kirsty is going to share with us what options there might be and some of the challenges around those as well. Really pleased to welcome Jim Nixon. Jim's the manager at Stoke City Council's ASB team. Jim actually manages the private ASB team. So what Jim is going to bring for us today is not just to look at some of the local authority powers that Jim can use, but also that impact of having to work across not just the social housing sector, but also into the private rented sector as well. And finally, and probably most importantly, he is our anchor today and is holding us all together. No pressure at all, Darren. Darren Burton works for Forbes Solicitors. He's the head of Housing Consultancy Services. At which point that feels like the perfect point to hand over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Janine. Good morning, everyone. As Janine said there, a lot of grey areas and a really interesting, complicated subject. So I think what better place to start than to introduce Inspector Tootle, John Tootle, who's going to give us the police perspective. He's brought his shield with him as well, just to make sure to battle for the questions. But I think it'd be really interesting, regarding what action the police are able to take or can't take, and what that means for from other agencies and how we have a collective approach to dealing with this challenging subject. So I'll hand you over to John. Can you just give us a bit of context, please?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. So John Tootle, everybody. I've been a police officer in Bradford in West Yorkshire for 20 years now. I've been an inspector for the last 5, and then 10 before that I was a sergeant. Yeah, cannabis is rife in Bradford and rife in West Yorkshire. I can't speak about the rest of the country, although I'm sure it's very similar. If I can, though, let me just start a little bit about sort of Bradford. You are more likely as a citizen in Bradford to be the victim of burglary than anywhere else in the country. You are sadly more likely as a citizen of Bradford to be raped in Bradford more than anywhere else in the country. Unfortunately, we topped the chart on them 2 areas, something that I'm not proud of in the slightest, but I'm trying to explain to you a little bit about the breadth of the issues that we face over in Bradford. And this may not be replicated throughout the country. So there may be some forces that you guys work with where they are able to prioritize this issue more than we are in Bradford. Last week, we found a cannabis farm with 5 Vietnamese, £2.75 million worth of cannabis. Sounds really good. We find it every day. Maybe to not that scale, but the amount of cannabis out there is shocking. It's shocking to me. Just background on me, I don't drink any alcohol. I don't smoke, nothing like that. I've never taken any drugs. So it's very, very different than what I'm used to in my life. What can we do about it, and do we take it seriously? I would say we take it seriously in terms of the importation side of it. I would say in terms of the cannabis farm, we take it serious. We've seen Albanians take over that trade in the last few years from local organised crime groups. The Albanians now run a large part of the cannabis trade in the UK. but there is still a lot of cannabis farms at that smaller end scale. So it's like me and maybe my friends and me and just myself, and I've got like a few plants in my house and they have cannabis farms. Taking it wider to what we're here to talk about today and just general cannabis smoking in properties, it's real difficult, if I'm honest with you. And I don't want to use the word tolerate it, but if you're me and you're the inspector for the area, would I rather people smoke it in their house than outside schools? Yes, I would. Do I accept that a lot of people, professionals in this room, police officers and other people take cannabis? Sadly, I do. I understand the knock-on effect that has to our mental health services because I've seen it in my own family with people who've been addicted to cannabis. But yeah, that's a little bit of an overview from where I come at it. In terms of what we can do, we do go in there with our housing partners. We do warrants where we can. But we have to look at two important facts in the police whenever we're trying to prosecute anybody. We have to look at, one, is there a realistic prospect of conviction? And two, is it in the public interest to prosecute? And there has to be like a value for money side of that. If we run a court case that costs a couple of £1,000s for a £10 bag of cannabis, it ain't going to be a runner. And I would dissuade my officers from using their time in that area. If I could, I would do much more on this. I really would. But in reality, it's difficult for us.
Thanks, John. So that leads us nicely over on to Craig now. I'm going to bring Craig in as an ASB lead for a large housing provider. So just, Craig, if you can just give us a bit of an insight in some of the barriers and challenges that you face and how you're able to overcome them and what that means for other providers elsewhere who can sort of share those experiences and resonate with them.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I think it's fair to say that, as John's alluded to, that cannabis smoking is definitely probably the biggest type of antisocial behaviour that most housing providers are dealing with, whether that's a registered social landlord, a council tenancy, a private landlord indeed. It's a fundamental part of our society, I think it's fair to say. And we know that people will smoke cannabis as part of their lifestyle, recreationally, with friends around, possibly even family members. And of course, there's people that have an addiction to it and they may need some support. But from a tenancy perspective, and with the antisocial behaviour officers that I manage, we know that cannabis smoking is now the most prevalent type of ASB that we are dealing with, more so than noise nuisance, violence, threats, harassment, intimidation, etc. And that's possibly cannabis use and drug abuse, drug misuse as well. I'm sure I speak for many colleagues that are on the webinar today who know that complainants of antisocial behaviour will always contact us and start waving and quoting tenancy conditions under our noses and saying, you have a duty to do this, you have a duty to address the breaches of the tenancy agreement. And fundamentally, they are quite right. We know that tenancy agreements vary depending on the age, the property, and perhaps when they were not less so stringent as they may be up today, you'll always find within a tenancy agreement the clause that discusses ASB in terms of a broad nuisance, harassment, alarm and distress, and that we would prohibit and do not allow the use of drugs. And of course, cannabis is part of that as an unlawful use of drugs. So we are duty bound to address those issues. How do we address it is another issue. That's really the sort of the complexity of it. One thing that we encourage is all our complainants to record diary sheets. And you've got to remember that where tenancy conditions are concerned, we are looking to the lower burden of proof than that of the police. So operating on the balance of probabilities that this act, this type of antisocial behaviour is occurring rather than not occurring. And that essentially what that means is that if you are looking for way down the track, some form of enforcement action, possibly even possession action, you just need to convince the judge over 50% that this type of behaviour that you are getting reports and complaints of is indeed taking place. So diary sheets are fundamentally important to us. In a nice structured way. They could be emails, they can be the formal logs that you may have on your templates, but the dates, the times, the impact, and that's the key part here, is the impact on that person's behaviour, their use of cannabis is having on the complainant's life. Now, it could be a nuisance, an annoyance, a smell. It could be that it's a fear that it's impacting on their children's health. It also might be to do with them or elderly family members, indeed, that might have medical issues, respiratory ailments. And, you know, of course, in today's world with COVID and the delicate nature of people's health, that the use of cannabis is having such a detrimental effect on them. Also, you've got to remember the types of properties that you have. So blocks of flats where the use of cannabis and the smoke can travel up, down, etc. On large concentrated estates, coming through air vents, even in the use of garden. No, I'm not doing it in my property, I'm in the garden, so it's in the open air. Well, that goes over the neighbour's fence. It's all having an impact. So when recording diary sheets, that's a really key element, the impact of it, and obviously the date and the time to identify any regularity, any frequency around that misuse. But we also do look to gather community impact statements, really proportionate and effective, where there's more than one complainant, and of course that will do away with the fear of a complainant reporting. I don't want to contact you. I don't want to put my name to anything because I'm scared of repercussions. We hear that in all types of ASB that we deal with. So community impact statements are really effective if you've got a couple or more complainants, and like I said, in a block of flats, that can be quite fruitful. If you're looking at victim statements, well, again, you're looking at the impact of that. You know, are they a victim of the cannabis smoking? How is it changing their life? You know, are they locking the windows? Particularly, I know we haven't had the greatest of summers, but in hot weather, are they feeling like they're a prisoner in their home? They're locking the windows. They can't go out into their garden. You know, fresh air, etc. And in addition to that, something that we do encourage our ASB officers to gather when looking to compile evidence is the partnership working. So do your disclosure requests to the police. Is there any intelligence around that address that the frequency of calls to the police, we're not putting the onus upon the police to take action, because as John's mentioned, it's about their priorities. But I'm sure that because of the good relationships we have with our police, their disclosure of calls they've had to that address can be very impactful as well. And I include in that the environmental health teams, because of course we are dealing with sort of obnoxious smells, etc. So that as an evidence bundle should be sufficient as a starting point to start to build your case against the perpetrator of the cannabis smoking. Now, looking at other measures, and I don't want to steal Jim's thunder here around what else we can explore. There are enforcement measures, but I think it's important to engage with the perpetrator as well, to look at what support can be offered, because if you are ended up in court, you're going to need to demonstrate your tiered approach to enforcement. You need to demonstrate what you've done to try and remedy the behaviours, but also what support have you offered to that person? You know, if you're starting to say to somebody your tenancy is at risk because of your behaviours, then you need to demonstrate any support measures, any signposting, any guidance you've offered to that alleged perpetrator to be able to help them. And of course, if you've done that and you're still several months down the line dealing with ASB nuisance, then of course you've got a really good log of everything you've attempted to remedy those behaviours.
Thanks, Craig. I completely agree there in terms of the importance of looking at each case on an individual basis and its various complexities. So that leads us on to Jim now, our next panel guest. Jim, as a lead for a local authority, and I think what Janine touched on earlier as well, the importance, Jim works across multiple tenures. So again, to offer us some perspective, not just from a registered housing provider, but basically the whole community, and understand the successes that you've had with the use of the community protection notice. So if you could give us a bit of context and share that with us, Jim, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Thanks, Darren. Sorry. Morning, everybody. Yeah, Jim Nixon. I'm the manager of Stoke Council ASB team. Totally agree with what John said. As an ex-police officer myself, I understand the challenges that cannabis has in modern policing in the 21st century. We have to be realistic, and I get sort of very frustrated sometimes when I see a lot of ASB practitioners kind of trying to lean on the police and say it's all the police's responsibility because we're dealing with a criminal offence. I totally get that, but I think what we've done in Stoke is realise that as a partner, as a key partner, we have to take the lead, because the police just haven't got the resources. When we do need their help, they are there. So in the private sector, it's obviously even more of a challenge, because we don't have that tenancy agreement that obviously, say, a housing association or housing stock within the council. So primarily dealing with the private sector, you've got the challenge of dealing with the private landlord. And in the majority of cases, they are very, very supportive. But also you've got that sort of more of a challenge because of that So again, already what's been said, my view is always about that harm-centered approach. It's always about looking at each case and on its individual merits, looking at that individual or individuals that are causing the nuisance, annoyance, the detrimental impact within that community, and looking at what we can do to help them. And we've done that in a lot of cases. We had a few cases on lockdown actually where it was linked to mental health. And we managed to get referrals in and managed to get that individual or those individuals the support that they desperately needed. But we will, obviously, if we start to hit a brick wall and we can see the impact, and Craig's already mentioned about the impact it has on neighbours and other residents, we start to look at some form of enforcement. We will start low level, obviously, with your warning letters. But one of the things that we've found to be very, very effective when we get to a point where we feel we've got to go a little bit further is the community protection warning. Now, there's obviously a lot of kind of queries, I suppose, around, can you say 100% it's cannabis? Are you professionally trained to say it's cannabis? Can you say it's definitely coming from that address? Obviously, my officers will do an investigation and they will try and pinpoint the address as best as they can. And we are very, very cautious around that so that we're not pointing the finger at the wrong residents. But one of the things that we've done just slightly different with our community protection warnings is we don't actually state that it's cannabis. So what we will put is, do not permit offensive or noxious fumes or odours to escape from your premises, such as likely to cause nuisance or annoyance to others in the vicinity. But what we also add on is this prohibition applies to all such fumes or odours, and in particular smells linked to the use of illegal substances. So we'll kind of sort of cover all, because in my experience, sometimes we will get other type odours that can cause problems. I've had issues in the past where certain cooking foods have caused nuisance and annoyance and caused a detrimental impact. So what we try and do is cover that all up, but obviously we are obviously pinpointing that it is a potential illegal substance too. We found that it's actually been very, very effective. And one of the other things that we do as well is we put a little bit of an extra sort of paragraph within the CPW to say that although we've gone down the CPW route initially, we may also consider other tools and powers within the 2014 Act. And I think as long as you can justify the proportionality and necessity moving forward, then like Craig said, you can look at other types of enforcement, like the injunction, if the impact is so great that you have to kind of look at that. But in Stoke, we've been very, very lucky that we don't go very far beyond the CPW. We found it to be very, very effective, as long as once you've issued that you keep the pressure on and you don't just forget about that CPW. I'm pretty confident we've only gone to CPN probably on a couple of occasions. So from our experience, we have found it very, very effective. So that's just a perspective from Stoke. As Janine already alluded to, we haven't got the magic answers, all of us, but that certainly has proved quite successful where I work. So I hope that's been useful.
Thanks, Jim. That's a really useful example of partnership work in there. And I know a lot of the delegates have raised the issue about identifying the smells. So by using other options and collectively looking at a range of smells that cause nuisance without being too specific, that's an option that I know colleagues can certainly look at when they go back to their own organisations. So next up, we've got legal solutions, legal options that are available to us as registered housing providers. So if I can hand you over to Kirsty now, please.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Just to echo really what everybody on the panel has said so far. So we've touched on the legal options, so injunctions and possessions. And as Craig said initially, we are dealing with the balance of probability. So it only has to be more likely than not, one, that it's cannabis or that it's causing a nuisance if it isn't cannabis, if it's another smell, for example. Perhaps important to highlight that if providers and other partners are seeking an injunction, when you're looking at a breach, you're then looking at the criminal standard of proof. So that is perhaps something that needs to be considered. Again, looking at something that Jim touched on, if it is other noxious smells, so it perhaps might not be cannabis, it might be another smell that's causing a nuisance. That may be an instance where partners want to look at lower level interventions. So is it a lifestyle issue? is this perhaps a case where mediation could be something that neighbours could look at and then try and live together in a more neighbourly way?
Thanks, Kirsty. Quite a key question that's come up from delegates today is around medical use and the medical need for cannabis. And I think the issue there is, as we said time and time again today, the individual basis, looking at the support element, but also having that evidence, that proof, that reassurance that that person does have a medical need, and how we work and support that. So I think I'd like to go to Craig now to share some experience there, if you could please, any examples that you've had across the regions where you work.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. So delegates on this call might be familiar with, well, certainly obviously the argument that I smoke cannabis because I have a medical ailment and it helps me and so on. That is not a defence to a breach of tenancy, or indeed causing the offence of cannabis smoking that's having the detrimental impact. Colleagues are probably familiar with the CAN card, which is a fairly new initiative that has been devised to support people's medicinal use of cannabis. Cannabis medicines became legal in 2018, and the CAN card is a recent introduction that sort of bridges the gap between sort of the doctors and other practitioners, and indeed patients who are looking for some sort of legitimate purpose of cannabis use. And indeed in Hyde, we've got a couple of cases at the minute where our residents are sort of flashing their CAN card and saying, well, you can't touch me because I've got this. That is not, as I said, a defence at all. It's not, having a CAN card is what we would class as a mitigating factor rather than a defence to possessing cannabis. So what we know is that if they are using cannabis medicinally, that is not prescribed in the smoking form. You know, herbal cannabis is not prescribed by anybody to smoke. Medicinal cannabis comes in oil form and almost like sweets, like gummies, kind of like your Haribo type things. And so we are very much of the opinion that even if they have a CAN card, that we are still entitled to take possession because of the use of the cannabis in the smoking form is causing the detrimental impact. And so, yes, again, we're not, you know, when we go around doing our Equality Act assessments and we look at all of the background to that person's medical history and their reasoning for using cannabis, we will make it clear that we've addressed the fact that smoking cannabis is by no means a defence. And obviously, I think it's fair to say that the various strains of cannabis that are out there as well are going to be causing that impact. So if you do hear about CAN card and the use of it, it's certainly, and they continue to smoke it, we are not addressing that as a defence or a reason to continue that smoking.
Can I just come in here, Darren? Because there's just a couple of things that I'm quite.
I was just about to bring you in, Janine, so that's
That's fine. I'm quite able to bring myself in. You know. There are a few things that we've been reflecting on, but I think in terms of the medical use, there's a couple of things for me that are really, really important. The first is that it's a really easy statement to throw around. I've been medically prescribed cannabis. My first response as a practitioner would be, show me the proof of that. And in the same respect as I think sometimes we hear some perpetrators of ASB say, I've got mental health problems. And we just accept that as a given and allow it to derail our case and our progress with the case, where really what we need is evidence of some of this stuff. So the first thing that I would be saying is, okay, if you've been prescribed cannabis, where's the kind of evidence of that through the doctor's, you know, diagnosis, prescription or whatever. But I think the second thing is, and I think this is something that for me it strikes through a number of the conversations that we've had already, is that just if someone's, even I'm getting what Craig has said about the method of ingesting that cannabis, but even if somebody is saying that they smoke cannabis for medical reasons, that might give them permission to smoke the cannabis, but it doesn't give them permission to cause the nuisance. And I think sometimes we get caught up in, when we get a report of cannabis smoking, what is it that's actually the issue? Is it the smoking of an illegal substance, or is it the nuisance that behaviour is having? And what I really liked about what Jim was saying was he's not tying himself down with his CPNs to saying you can't smoke cannabis. I don't care what you're smoking, that's irrelevant it's the impact that it's having on other people. And I think it's really important that we hold on to that. Because that helps us a little bit with the identification issue as well, because I said it doesn't matter what is causing the smoke, it's the impact that that smoke is having. For me, I think we talk a lot about harm-centred approaches to ASB, and we've already sort of touched on that through our discussions. And for me, never is a truer kind of concept than when we're talking about cannabis smoking. Because I think it's not a type of ASB that you can say we're definitely always going to deal with this, or we're definitely never going to deal with it. I think it's really one of those that you absolutely have to look at the circumstances around the smoking. You know, what is the impact that it's having? How many people is it affecting? You know, is it causing somebody medical issues because it's getting through the vents into the neighbour's house and it's causing asthma attacks or exacerbating a lung condition? Because that's very, very different to someone smoking a bit of cannabis in their home, that the only way you know about that is because the housing officer has gone to do an inspection, has smelt it in the property, but it's not having an impact on anyone else. And I think in terms of being realistic about some of this stuff, it really has to be a case-by-case decision as to whether you get involved at all, and then equally to how much of a degree you get involved in. So I think it's just this really is an example of having to have that harm-centred approach to be able to resolve issues like this. And sometimes it might be about saying it's not something we deal with.
Thanks, Janine. On the back of that, John, could you give a police perspective in terms of the harm-centred approach and how you can support housing providers, albeit maybe not with legal action, but in terms of, you know, the work on the ground, really, in terms of the community feel?
Yeah, so I mean, we work real closely with our housing providers. In Communities is the biggest one in Bradford, so we work regular with them. We have meetings. My sergeant's in a meeting upstairs now with the housing providers where they're talking about the sort of tenancy issues that's causing the most issues. We will go and support them regularly whenever they request it. So it's not that we don't do this work. What I would say is we just don't proactively seek out that work, if that makes sense. It is more of a reactive one based on when you guys, our partners in the housing, our partners in the local authority, really come to us for it. But yeah, we have to look at we use a Thrive model. The threat, harm and risk model is what we use now in the police, certainly in West Yorkshire. But yeah, whenever we get any requests, we're more than happy to go. And we've been getting a lot of requests this year from the utility companies. So a lot of your electricity companies, etc., again, like massive bills in for places and stuff like that, are seeing ridiculous. They're getting warrants out for us because they realise that, you know, we're obviously struggling badly, and we go and support them with the warrants. So they get the warrants and we go with them. So we've had a few of those cases recently.
Thanks, John. Along that thread of support and medical use, how do we work with support agencies and bring them on at a local level as well? I think this would be a good one for Jim, if I can bring you in, Jim, please.
Yeah, what we do, Craig, Darren, is we obviously have a regular partnership meeting every week now, and we used to call it threat and grip, but we've kind of sort of toned that down now. But essentially what we've done now is we've pulled in those support services as well within that meeting. So it's not just about police and the direct kind of enforcement agencies within the council. We bring in the wider support kind of community as well in terms of organisations. So when we've got these persistent problems, we can get that referral in an awful lot quicker, and we can build up that. So for me, it's all just about that great partnership arrangement. And I know the challenges, and I'm not going to sit here and be naive to say that certain areas don't have challenges. They do have challenges. But I think it's about building up those relationships as best as you can with the limited resources we've got. And for the high priority cases, we are able to get that support fairly quickly, as long as you are persistent, and you know, and you have that consistent kind of attendance from those agencies within those partnership meetings. So I think that's how we've kind of done that within Stoke, is just having that regular focus with a large, I'll say large, but the key partners within our area, and I think that works really effectively. And as I said, you know, there were a couple of cases on lockdown where there were some cannabis issues that were, you know, related to the sort of the mental health side of it and the lockdown impacts, and we were able to get those individuals referred. And what it did then, it did I'm not saying that it completely reduced the usage, but what it did was, as Janina said, it reduced that impact so that, again, you can calm it down so you're not in the position where you are taking enforcement action. I think we all have to be realistic to say that you're not always going to get people to stop their cannabis use 100%. But I think if you can stop that detrimental impact, that impacts on those individuals who are affected, then I think we're doing our job and we're being realistic about what we can achieve.
Thanks, Jim. Janine, as someone who works on behalf and supports a number of different providers throughout the UK, any partnership barriers that you've come across that you'd like to share with us?
I suppose it's just the things that we've covered already in terms of cannabis smoking. And I think one of the things that John and I spoke about last week is I think frustrations arise in partnership working where, so for example, if you are a local authority officer or you're a housing officer and you go to the police and you say, we've got an issue in this property with somebody smoking cannabis, and then the police officer turns around and says, well, we don't deal with that, full stop, and doesn't explain why there's those challenges and difficulties, then I think that creates the partnership issues, because I think what then happens is the officer goes, oh, well, they're just being obstructive, and then you get that complete breakdown in relationship. So I think this is a partnership working point that extends far beyond cannabis smoking, but that kind of understanding each other's challenges, agendas can go a long way in making sure that relationships are strong. And that was why we were so keen to have John along today, was just to bring that level of realism. This isn't the police saying, do you know what, we're not going to deal with this problem, we're shirking responsibility. It's actually that real realism that on the scale of all the things that we have to deal with as police forces, this unfortunately just isn't going to hit the priority list. It just can't. And I think that's the thing. It's about understanding why partners aren't doing things. Otherwise, your assumption is that they're just being obstructive or trying to shy away from work. So I think it's that understanding of each other that's really, really important. That why question. So why can't you do anything? Darren, and you're on mute.
I didn't click the button enough there. Sorry about that, folks. So over to Kirsty now, when we have exhausted the other options and we've got to go for the tenancy enforcement option at the end of the scale, can you just give us a bit of context around that and share some experience for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So it will obviously be a decision for partners as to whether you want to look at an injunction or whether you want to go for possession. And we all know that the courts will expect eviction really to be sort of something of last resort. So if other enforcement action hasn't been tried, first of all, I would imagine that in most cases, obviously we can't generalise, as everybody said on the panel, we have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. You'd then be looking at going for an injunction, perhaps to enforce tenancy terms and or to stop breaches of tenancy terms. And again, the panel have already discussed the standard of proof that the court would be looking at. So we'd be looking at, is it more likely than not that it's cannabis? Is it more likely than not that it's causing a nuisance and or annoyance? And I think it was Craig talked about the importance of diary sheets and a community impact. And again, that would be something that the court would be looking at, because it wouldn't, in my experience, just be enough to go in front of a judge and say, well, this person's smoking cannabis. Well, okay, fair enough. I've had judges say to me, and where's the nuisance element? Where are your residents that are saying, this is bothering me, this is a pain? Craig again alluded to residents not being able to open the windows, for example, and I've had cases where that has been the case, and residents that don't feel able to sit in the back garden because they're just overcome by cannabis fumes. So that would be the sort of thing really that the court will be looking at. And again, for possession, we'll be looking at the same standard of proof there, whether in reality a court is going to grant you an outright possession order because somebody's smoking cannabis. In my experience, it's highly unlikely. We know from case law, I think the most recent case was City West and Massey a couple of years ago. Even when a person is involved in cannabis production, it can be difficult enough to get an outright possession order. So really, I think it's about managing expectations all around, managing resident expectations, managing partners' expectations. Just because there is cannabis smoking going on, that doesn't automatically mean that the housing provider can go to court and get the person evicted. So it's about really, again, and Janine and John have talked about the importance of partnership working, keeping the lines of communication open and being realistic, not just about what the police can do, about what housing providers and local authorities can do as well to tackle the issue within the constraints of case law and the legislation and tools and powers that are available.
Can I just come in there, Darren, a little bit about diary sheets? Because obviously diary sheets are incredibly important, but one of the, just as a note of caution, what I still see happening is diary sheets being issued as a way of kind of batting the problem off and kind of going, I need you to fill in these diary sheets for 4 weeks so I can assess how serious the problem is and whether we do anything. And then 4 weeks comes along and they get issued another batch for 4 weeks, and it gets the problem gets kicked into the long grass because essentially the officer doesn't quite know the answer, so it's just to keep the resident sort of batting it forward. And I think there's something here about managing expectations which is massively important, particularly with our residents. And I think if we have made the decision that this is cannabis smoking, yes, but actually it's not a situation where, you know, it's having a huge impact. It's not a situation where we're going to be anywhere near going down the lines of looking at possession or injunctions, that we have those conversations with the residents as early as possible. Because if we keep issuing diary sheets, what we're saying to that resident, whether we're saying it explicitly or not, is, yes, this is a problem that we're going to resolve, and you just need to keep filling in these diary sheets for us so that we have the evidence to do it. And I think that the big thing here is about being decisive once you've done your investigations, being decisive, but then managing the expectations of that complainant.
Thanks, Janine.
Sorry, Darren, can I come in just on a couple of points?
Yes, sure.
So just picking up what Janine was saying, and it's absolutely right. You don't want to get to the stage where you are gathering, you're letting things drift for months and months because you don't think you've got, you know, that amount of diary sheets that's going to be evidential. But don't forget, as a professional, and if you, let's not kid ourselves, we all know what cannabis smells like. We all know the sort of really what the obnoxious smell can be like, whether that's in your working capacity or outside. If you was to just go around the shops or down the estate of a night, you might smell it. But don't forget, in terms of evidence gathering, unannounced visits to the property and you smelling it once or indeed over a little period of time is brilliant. You as a professional witnessing that, or, you know, if you do an announced visit, likely there's going to be nothing. Unannounced visits. Also use your maintenance and your repair and your contractor staff. If you happen to know you've got an address that is of interest because of the regular type of ASB or cannabis smoking, and you know that there's a repair happening, put them on alert. Get them to feed back to you what they found at that address while they were out there. That's really good evidence as well. So I do think that other than relying upon the diary sheets, there are other mechanisms we can use. And just picking up on Kirsty's point around the enforcement, don't forget, as you know, whether it's a registered housing provider or indeed council staff, join up your enforcement action with that is already underway. So if you've got rent arrears and there is a suspended possession order under rent arrears, vary the order to include antisocial behaviour. You know, there's lots of case law and methods that we can use to vary our enforcement where antisocial behaviour is concerned.
Thanks, Craig. Jim, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think one of the things that we try and do is like Janine said, try and avoid the diary sheet straight away. We'll sort of get out there, smell it for ourselves. You know, my officers are, you know, really experienced. They do know what cannabis smells like, even though I suppose they can't be classed as ultimate, you know, professional experts. But it gives you a good opportunity to assess it properly yourself, and then we will obviously then, if it persists, we'll then obviously start the route of warning letters, asking then diary sheets to be completed so that we can gather that impact and that evidence. So yeah, I think sometimes it's good to get in there early because you can stop a lot of these problems from escalating. So that's just our view from the Stoke point of view.
Thanks, Jim. John, any recommendations from a police point of view in terms of evidence gathering and support you can give to housing providers?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what Janine said, and I think sometimes the residents do feel a little bit like that because we do it all the time in terms of giving them like diary books for ASB and saying, can you make a note and can you keep it in there? But in reality, how many other ways is there? I mean, CCTV obviously is good, but I know you're going to have problems there apart from maybe in communal areas where you will have it, you won't have it inside residential properties. So, I mean, it's a real difficult one. We would probably go down the similar lines of what Craig was talking about, in fairness.
Thanks, John.
Can I just pick up on one point, Darren? Because I know it was it was something that was quite common in a lot of the questions that was posed to us before this session, which was around identifying the smell of cannabis. And I guess it's just important. Kirsty and I had this conversation last week, and on the balance of probability, which is what we're working with on quite a lot of the tools that we've been discussing at the moment, and obviously that's the threshold that you need to make the decision on as to whether you believe that the reports have happened or not. We feel quite content that a resident can, on the balance of probability, say that it's cannabis that they're smelling. I think, we know the different people know the difference between a smell of nicotine and a smell of cannabis. So I guess sometimes I think we get caught up a little bit in, well, it's got to be professionally witnessed, and until it is, there's nothing that we can do. And then obviously, because of capacity and resources, the chance of getting it professionally witnessed is very low. So then you end up with cases that are open for a long time, while perhaps you're seeking for a professional judgment that you don't need. So again, I would just reflect that back, and just in terms of explicitly answering that question, on the balance of probability, I'm quite happy, and have done previously, on taking action based on a resident saying that it's cannabis, or from me as a ASB officer from saying it's cannabis, and this is how I know.
Thanks, Janine. I think it's interesting speaking to environmental health colleagues as well. A number of them, as you say, are happy for housing providers, staff to acknowledge the smell of cannabis, interpret what it is, and residents as well. Whereas there's still some who may want a professional witness. So that does differ up and down the country. But as you say, it's not getting hung up on that and looking at the impact that it's having on the individual people, isn't it? So in terms of support options now, so non-legal options, as a sector, we're very good at sharing best practice and examples. So is there anything we can share with people in terms of any approaches that have been used in different parts of the country to resolve issues? Craig, have you got anything there for that one?
I think we generally will look to advocacy support services that are available in the community. And that's really on both sides. That's both on the complainant and the alleged perpetrator. If people are requiring assistance to get off of cannabis, then again, make referrals to your local authorities, Mareks, if there is some sort of drug issues, etc., going on. But don't forget, if you are looking to serve a community protection warning, and indeed escalate to a notice point when dealing with perpetrators, it's really good as part of that CPN or CPW to put a requirement in there for that person to engage with support services. I know there's another separate conversation I think Janine's taken care of with use of community protection warnings and delegated powers and so on. But I mean, I agree with Jim, who earlier said, they're a very, very effective way of dealing with obnoxious smells generally, albeit that cannabis or other ASB. But making sure that you're using that CPW for a prerequisite to engage with partner agencies. But yeah, I mean, if in terms of Hyde, obviously we have a tenancy sustainment and support team where we'll make referrals to people that need some form of like mental health outlet reach, obviously trying to engage with their GPs, getting signed authority from the complainant to talk to their GP to get evidence around the impact. So I think it's really important just to explore all avenues, look at what's out there in your community, look what the local authority can offer on both sides, really, because again, picking up Janine's point, this is very much a case-by-case basis. We know it's prevalent throughout a lot of our ASB casework, but each case does have its own merits and quirks, and so I think it's really just to look at it holistically, explore all your options.
Thanks, Craig. One of the questions that we've had as well is in terms of blocks of flats isolating the smells and how anyone deals with that. I know with there've been some examples where some housing providers have issued air purifiers to get rid of the smells. So anything that you can recommend on that? Any examples that you've used in your housing association? Obviously, bring Jim in after this as well for
yeah.
local authority.
I think certainly there is the argument that if it is persistent and it's possibly reasonable to have a survey of that property done, because obviously depending on the age of the property, or indeed whether it's relatively new, again, we have examples where There might be an issue with the cavity walls and the air vents are not correct. Is there suitable ventilation in the property that may have the offensive smells coming from it? You know, again, if you have a persistent report and everything else does seem that it's taken care of and it's carrying on, do explore the makeup of the flat. Is an assessment required around the ventilation? Is it appropriately built, as it were? But just have a look and get the experts in that might be able to confirm that everything is okay within that flat. And again, if that is okay and taken care of, then again you may be looking at the enforcement action, because again it's something else you can demonstrate you've covered off.
Thanks, Craig. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, exactly the same as Craig said, really, Darren. You know, it's about, we've had a couple of cases where we've done that, where we've got the experts in to look at it. And again, I think it comes back to what I said earlier, when you've got a sort of a high rise, I think it's about getting out there and sort of assessing it properly. Sometimes, you know, if you're just dealing with it from the desk, and like we said, we're sending diary sheets out, sometimes you can't really pinpoint the problem. So I think for me, what I sort of encourage my officers to do is get out there and try and sort of pinpoint, knock a few doors if we have to, you know. Sometimes that's the best way that you can kind of identify the smells. So I think it's the two-pronged approach, really. But yeah, that's again where we've sort of seen the level of success, is just getting out there early.
Thanks, Jim. John, in terms of dealing with issues in flats in Bradford, anything you'd like to share with us? Where there have been multiple complainants?
Yeah, I mean, we do get this quite a lot. We've got a lot of high-rise flats in Bradford. A lot of the ones, sadly, they seem to be like mates that smoke it together and stuff. So they go into each other's. When you get high-rise flats, you seem to congregate. So sometimes you're dealing with complaints in one flat, and then they're actually linked to another one too. So it's more the knock-on effect than us, rather than anything really positive to share about that.
Okay, thanks.
I think we've Darren, sorry, you seem to be getting called Craig an awful lot this morning, so apologies. But I think one of the things that we did briefly mention was mediation, and I think that's really important, because look, let's be realistic. I think what we've said is that the amount of cases that we're actually going to see all the way through to enforcement action are probably very, very small in relation to cannabis smoking. So sometimes this is going to be about a pragmatic approach to solving some of these problems. And you know what, if it's mediation between parties, so that the person smoking the cannabis can understand the impact that their smoking is having, and even if the solutions are very practical, like an agreement not to smoke it in the house, then maybe that is the solution, because although it's not the magic wand, at least it's stopping the harm to that victim. And I think it might have been Jim, you mentioned the same. Sometimes this isn't going to be about stopping the cannabis smoking. It's not going to be about stopping somebody from smoking, but what it's going to be is about reducing the impact that has on other people. So things like mediation, yeah, we might not traditionally think of them for issues like this, but actually a real role to play, I think.
Thanks, Janine. Going back to sort of the partnership feel as well, has there been any examples? I know one of our delegates mentioned, say, for example, looking at something of pooling resources from the G15, for example. Is there anything that can be done on a regional level that anyone would like to add there? Because not just on your local level in terms of the local authority boundaries, but looking bigger in terms of tackling this problem collectively. Has anyone got any advice or opinions to share on that? Janine, well, if you want to...
So all I would say, I don't have any solutions in terms of how to make that happen, but what I'd really like to see us is getting away from that. It's a housing problem, it's a police problem. That batting cannabis smoking back and forward, that helps nobody. It certainly doesn't help the complainants, and it doesn't help from a partnership working point of view. So I think in terms of takeaway points from this, I think if this is something that your area is really struggling with, I think there's a real need to have a partnership conversation, to come up with a consistent line to help manage expectations and to stop this kind of batting between partners, because as I said, that really doesn't help anybody.
Thanks, Janine. I think really at this time now it's quite useful to kind of go around the panelists for any last bits of tips and advice, really. So before we look at closing and summing up. So Craig, would you like to say anything? Anything in addition?
Other than really be confident in the action you're taking. Don't, Janine's just mentioned about partnership working, and I do think I saw that question, Darren, that was put forward around maybe local strategy groups to deal with cannabis smoking, and I think there's maybe some merit in that. So you have that partnership approach. We all have our information sharing agreements, but it's a collective agreement as to where responsibility lies, but also how we need one another. So I do think locally, possibly something to explore. But as I say, be confident in the action you're taking and the robust approach. Just again, picking up Janine's point, we find ourselves having very frank but professional conversations with our alleged perpetrators around, I don't particularly care if you want to cause harm to yourself or continue smoking cannabis, but don't put your property at risk by doing it at your home or in your communal areas. Wander around your local park if you need to, go for a walk around the block. I know that's kind of, an idealistic approach, but by having that frank conversation with the person that is causing the nuisance and the smells, then that's probably, that's something that we find really beneficial. But no, I think this has been really useful. So thank you, Darren and Janine, everybody else.
Thanks, Craig. Jim?
I think for me, Darren, it's about what I said earlier on in the conversation. I think we've got to get into this kind of mindset that, from a local authority point of view, from my own perspective, it's our problem, really. We need to lead on it. We have to be realistic that the police really can't do an awful lot, as John's already alluded to. So I think, again, I try and put victim and that impact at the heart of what we do, so that we are squabbling about who's going to take it on. I think we've been quite lucky in Stoke that there is that kind of understanding, and we just crack on with it and get, they do their bits, like they'll do sort of closure orders for me and stuff like that, and we do our bit. And I think it's about having that understanding. So good partnership arrangement is really important for me.
Thanks, Jim. Any final comments from Kirsty from a legal perspective? Obviously about avoiding getting to legal in the first place, but when it does, we're equipped to deal with it.
Well, actually, I think this follows on quite nicely from what Jim said. So in order to keep your partnership working, I think, just to repeat what I said earlier, managing expectations, your own expectations, the lead agency's expectations, partners' expectations, and witnesses and complainants' expectations as well. Because if you're having these open, honest discussions about what is achievable at the very outset of a case, you're much less likely to find anybody disappointed or any of these relationships breaking down further on down the line.
Thanks, Kirsty. John, any more comments in terms of that partnership link, particularly between police and housing?
Yeah, definitely. What I want to say is, don't be put off by my negativity, guys. If I've come across that way, I really do apologize. I think what I wanted to do was just be honest with you, as professionals and stuff, and just let you know. But what is the case in Bradford may not be the case in some other parts of the country. And what I would say is, we're still more than willing and more than happy to work with each of us. I think it's really important that we talk honestly with each other and let each other know what's going on. But please don't forget the police just because they are obviously struggling with other issues, and I get that everyone else is too. So no, just thank you and keep talking to us.
Thanks, John. I'd like to thank all our panel members, and I'd like to hand you back to Janine now, just for summing up at the end of this discussion. Thanks, Janine.
I feel like I've been missed again. So I'm just before I close up, I just want to add 2 points to that sort of takeaway bit. So one of the things that I would encourage housing providers to think about, based on the conversations we've had today, is the merits or otherwise of thinking about delegated authority for the community protection notice. I think when the legislation first came in, there was a feel within RPs that perhaps we didn't need the community protection notice because we had tenancy breach powers, etc. And I think perhaps over time what we've seen is, while it might not be a power that housing providers use day in, day out, for certain situations like cannabis smoking, actually having the ability to use the CPN might be really, really helpful. There is some research coming out very soon from Sheffield Hallam Uni around the CPN. They've been out and spoken to a number of practitioners, and some recommendations that will fall out of that will hopefully help those conversations. Because I know for housing providers who work across a number of local authority areas, delegated authority is perhaps not as easy as it might sound on the tin. So there is hopefully some academic work, some work that Darren and I are doing that will hopefully help a little bit in terms of that delegated authority issue. And then the other thing that I just wanted to say is, I think it's really important that we have policies that support our decision making. So, make sure that your policy, if it's your ASB policy, make sure it supports that kind of harm-centred assessment assessment of reports, you know, or do you have a separate cannabis smoking policy? But it's our policies that give us the shields and the confidence to make decisions and have difficult conversations. And I know certainly as officers, we don't like having difficult conversations because we want to help everybody, but sometimes our policy can help facilitate those conversations because we can clearly explain to people why we might not be able to do things that they expect from us. So that's kind of my last 2 pennies for what it's worth. But otherwise, just to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody that's on the panel. I mean, I'm sure we could have carried on speaking for probably the rest of the day about this subject. But I particularly have got some real value from the conversations and the points that people have raised. Thank you for Forbes for hosting the event, for putting the tech side and for dealing with registrations. Always very, very thankful for that support. And then finally to say a huge thank you to the vast number of people that joined today and listened into the conversations. I hope that that's been useful. Just to say that, as I said, there will be a recording that comes around via email, and also some contact details for myself and Darren should you wish to kind of explore anything further or have any questions that have fallen out from today's discussion. And also there'll be details of some future events that are being organised. So for example, Forbes are doing a webinar in November on the role of housing in helping to address issues, serious organised crime issues, which I think will be fascinating, particularly as it's being jointly run with Ireland. So a real opportunity to share learning across nations. So really looking forward to that one. Otherwise, it just leaves me to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.